Jason spent his entire life searching for the woman who gave birth to him. He imagined her in crowded train stations, in the faces of strangers at grocery stores, in the quiet sadness of older women who looked at him a second too long. He told himself she had not abandoned him because she did not care. She must have been trapped. She must have been afraid. She must have loved him from a distance, waiting for the courage to come back. But the truth was crueler than anything Jason had prepared himself to survive. The mother he had dreamed about was not lost somewhere far away. She had been living under the same roof with him for years, wearing pearls at breakfast, smiling for charity photographs, and calling him a burden every chance she got. By the time Jason finally learned who she really was, the damage had already spread through his life like a crack through old glass. The woman he loved had left him. His son had grown up without knowing his father. And the family name Jason had nearly destroyed himself trying to earn turned out to be nothing more than a beautiful cage built around a terrible secret. The worst part was not that Eleanor Sterling had given him away when he was a newborn. The worst part was that when fate brought him back into her home, she chose to reject him all over again, every single day, with open eyes. Jason's story began in a quiet Connecticut town where the winters were sharp, the houses were old, and everyone seemed to know whose child belonged to which family. But no one really knew where Jason belonged. He was raised in a small white house at the edge of town by Esther Mallory, a gentlewoman with tired hands and a heart that had somehow stayed soft despite everything life had taken from her. Esther was not rich. She did not own anything that would impress the kind of people who measured worth by silverware, surnames, and invitations. But she gave Jason something far rarer. She gave him a home where he never had to earn his place at the table. Esther had a way of making small things feel safe. She patched his coat before the first snow. She saved coins in a blue jar so he could buy parts from the old repair shop. She let him take apart broken alarm clocks on the kitchen table, even when springs flew across the room and tiny screws rolled under the stove. Jason was a quiet boy, the kind who listened more than he spoke, but when he studied the inside of a clock, something in him came alive. To other children, the wheels and levers were just metal. To Jason, they were proof that even the smallest hidden piece could matter. If one gear was missing, the whole machine lost its rhythm. Esther noticed that before anyone else did. She would watch him bend over those broken clocks with a seriousness far beyond his age, and she would tell him that time was not only something people lost. Sometimes, if they were patient enough, time could bring back what belonged to them. Jason carried those words close, especially on the nights when the question of his birth mother pressed against his heart. Esther never lied to him about being adopted. She told him he had been placed in her arms as a baby, fragile and feverish, wrapped in a blanket too fine for a woman like Esther to have owned. She told him his mother was alive, and when Jason asked why she had not come for him, Esther would only look away for a moment before saying that some people needed a long time to become brave. That sentence became the first religion of Jason's childhood. Somewhere his mother was alive. Somewhere she remembered him. Somewhere she was waiting for the day when she could stand in front of him and explain everything. Jason did not imagine her as cruel. Children rarely imagine cruelty when hope is the only thing they have. He pictured her as a woman trapped by circumstance, perhaps poor, perhaps sick, perhaps threatened by people stronger than she was. He forgave her before he even knew her name. Every birthday he secretly wondered if that would be the year she appeared. Every time a strange car slowed near Esther's house, his heart lifted before shame pulled it back down. Then Esther died, and Jason learned that grief could make a house feel larger and emptier at the same time. He was still young enough to need someone, but old enough to understand that need itself could become a humiliation in the wrong room. The person who stepped forward was Charles Sterling, the respected owner of Sterling and Company, a luxury watchmaking house known for handcrafted timepieces sold to collectors, politicians, and families who passed heirlooms down like proof of bloodline. Charles had known Esther for years. She had cleaned offices for his company when Jason was small, and later she had brought broken clocks to the Sterling workshop because she knew the old craftsman there would give spare parts to a curious boy. Charles saw something in Jason that reminded him of the older generation of watchmakers' men who could hear a faulty movement before opening the case. He first offered Jason an apprenticeship. Then, after Esther's funeral, when it became clear the boy had nowhere safe to go, Charles offered something larger. He brought Jason into the Sterling home. In public, people praised his kindness. A wealthy man taking in a gifted orphan made a beautiful story. It fit neatly into newspaper columns and charity speeches. But inside the Sterling mansion, kindness had to pass through Eleanor. Eleanor Sterling was Charles's wife, and every inch of her seemed arranged to send one message: she had never been touched by disorder. Her hair was always smooth, her voice always controlled, her clothes always elegant without appearing to try. At fundraisers, she spoke about dignity. At luncheons, she spoke about duty. She could make guests feel privileged just to be noticed by her. But Jason learned very quickly that Eleanor's grace was a performance reserved for people whose opinions mattered. To him, she offered the colder version of herself, the one that came out in closed hallways and breakfast rooms after Charles had left for the workshop. She never screamed. That would have been too ordinary. Eleanor wounded with precision. When Jason thanked her for letting him stay, she reminded him that gratitude was the minimum expected from someone living under another family's roof. When he wore a suit Charles had bought him for a company event, she adjusted the collar with 2 fingers, as if touching something unclean, and told him fine fabric did not make a boy a gentleman. When he worked late at the bench and earned praise from the master horologists, she said talent was often mistaken for character by sentimental men. She never let him forget that he had been taken in. She made the word adopted sound like a stain. Jason told himself he could endure it because Charles was kind. Charles was not perfect, and he was often too busy to see the full shape of what happened in his own home, but he treated Jason with a warmth that felt real. He asked about his designs. He let him study rare movements from the company archives. He placed a hand on Jason's shoulder when a prototype worked. Those moments mattered. Yet every moment of warmth from Charles seemed to sharpen Eleanor's resentment. The more Jason succeeded, the more she looked at him as if he had stolen something. He did not understand why his existence offended her so deeply. He only knew that every time she looked at him, he felt like a mistake someone had failed to erase. So Jason became very good at proving himself. He learned to be useful before anyone could call him needy. He woke early, worked late, spoke carefully, dressed properly, and studied until his eyes burned. He learned the language of balance, wheels, escapements, bridge plates, mainsprings, and jeweled bearings. But more than the mechanics, he understood the emotion of a watch. A watch was a promise that something continued even when no one was looking. It held weddings, inheritances, retirements, apologies, and goodbyes. People bought watches to measure time, but they kept them because time had touched someone they loved. At 19, Jason created the design that changed Sterling and Company forever. The company had been struggling quietly. Younger buyers considered Sterling beautiful but old-fashioned, and the board was beginning to whisper about selling to a larger luxury group. Jason stayed in the workshop after everyone went home and built a collection inspired by the old clocks Esther had let him dismantle as a child. It was elegant without being cold modern, without betraying tradition. The second hand moved in an unusually smooth sweep, almost like a heartbeat refusing to stop. Charles knew the design was special the moment he saw it. When the collection launched, orders came in from London, Geneva, Dubai, and New York. Sterling was suddenly alive again. For the first time, Jason felt the hunger inside him quiet a little. At the celebration dinner, Charles stood in front of investors and called him the future of sterling craftsmanship. Later, as a private gift, he handed Jason the keys to a car. It was not the car that mattered. It was the look in Charles's eyes, the pride Jason had spent years trying to earn. For one brief evening, Jason almost believed he had become more than a rescued boy in someone else's house. Then Eleanor passed behind him and murmured that charity had become very expensive these days. Just like that, the warmth drained out of the room. That was the pattern of Jason's young adulthood. Every achievement lifted him toward belonging, and every word from Eleanor pushed him back down. He began to believe love was something that had to be earned through excellence, and even then could be revoked without warning. That belief followed him everywhere, even into the one place where he should have been free of it. He met Emily Carter during a late autumn afternoon when he brought a damaged pocket watch into the small bookshop where she worked part-time. The watch belonged to an elderly customer who had tucked a note inside the case, and Jason had gone there to return it. Emily noticed the way he handled the watch, not as a product, but as if it contained someone's life. Emily was not impressed by the sterling name. That was the first thing that disarmed him. She knew the company, of course. Everyone in town did. But she did not treat Jason like an heir, a curiosity, or a charity story. She asked him what made watches worth repairing when phones could tell time more easily. Jason, who usually answered questions with restraint, found himself explaining that people did not repair watches because they needed the hour. They repaired them because someone had once worn them through mornings they could not get back. Emily listened as if every word mattered. By the time he left the shop, Jason felt something he had not felt in years. He felt seen without being inspected. Their relationship grew slowly, then all at once. Emily had a gentleness that was not weakness and a strength that did not need to announce itself. She had grown up with less money than the Sterlings, but more honesty. Her mother had worked double shifts at a clinic. Her father had left when she was young, and Emily had learned early that people could survive abandonment without becoming bitter. She was studying early childhood education, saving money, and living in a small apartment above a bakery that smelled like sugar in the mornings. When Jason visited her there, he felt embarrassed by how peaceful it made him. Nothing in Emily's life was grand, but everything felt real. With Emily, Jason did not have to perform certainty. He could admit he missed Esther. He could talk about the mother he had never met. He could confess how much Eleanor's contempt still hurt him, even though he hated himself for caring. Emily never mocked his longing. She understood that a person could be grown and still carry the unanswered questions of a child. She told him that being unwanted by one person did not make him unworthy of love. Jason wanted to believe her. Some evenings, sitting beside her with the city noise softened by rain, he almost did. But fear is patient. It waits beneath happiness until happiness asks for courage. When Emily became pregnant, Jason was not ready for the shape of the choice in front of him. Emily told him with trembling hope, not because she expected life to become easy, but because she believed love could become brave when it needed to. Jason should have taken her hands. He should have remembered every night he had waited for a mother who never came. He should have understood better than anyone what it meant for a child to be treated like an inconvenience. Instead, the old terror rose in him. He saw Eleanor's face. He heard her voice. He imagined the board, the inheritance, the whispers, the accusation that he had brought disgrace into the Sterling home after everything Charles had done for him. Eleanor did not need to know the whole truth to sense weakness. She had always been skilled at finding the loose thread in someone's heart. When she noticed Jason growing distracted, she pressed until enough of the story came out. She did not comfort him. She did not ask whether he loved Emily. She reminded him of his position, his debt, his unfinished place in a family that could still cast him out. She painted Emily as a threat, the baby as a trap, and responsibility as a scandal. And Jason, who had spent years mistaking acceptance for survival, listened. He let Eleanor's fear become his own. The conversation that ended his relationship with Emily became the shame he carried for years. He did not simply say he was afraid. He did not simply ask for time. In his panic, he chose the cruelest possible way to protect himself. He made Emily feel alone at the exact moment she had trusted him with their future. He told her he could not be the father of that child. He suggested money where love should have been. And in the worst sentence of his life, he asked her to end the pregnancy so both of them could move on. The moment the words left him, something in Emily's face closed. She did not collapse. She did not beg. She became very still, and that stillness frightened him more than tears would have. Emily left town soon after. Jason told himself it was better that way because cowards often rename their cowardice as mercy. He told himself she would build another life. He told himself the child might not even be born. He buried the thought before it could become a face. Eleanor acted as if the matter had been handled, and Jason let that word handle sit in his stomach like a stone. From the outside, his life continued upward. He became more important inside Sterling and Company. His designs carried the company into a new era. Magazines called him brilliant. Collectors asked for his signature. Employees respected him. But inside, something essential had gone quiet. 7 years passed, and Jason became exactly the kind of man he had once thought would finally be safe. He had money, reputation, influence, and access to rooms that had once made him feel small. He had an office above the workshop and a nameplate on the door. Yet the more successful he became, the more haunted he felt by the absence of the life he had refused. He sometimes saw children walking with their fathers near the town green and felt a sharp, irrational ache he refused to examine. He never asked about Emily. He was afraid of what he might learn, and more afraid of what he had no right to ask. Eleanor's control did not fade as Jason grew older. It only changed its shape. She no longer called him a boy, but she still treated his belonging as conditional. She reviewed his public appearances, criticized his relationships before they could become serious, and reminded him that the Sterling name survived because people like her protected it from weakness. Jason had become essential to the company, but in her presence he could still feel like a child, waiting outside a locked door. That was Eleanor's power. She knew how to make people depend on approval she had no intention of giving. One night, after a disastrous dinner with investors, Eleanor cornered Jason in the mansion's marble hallway and accused him of forgetting where he came from. The accusation should have been absurd because she was the one who never allowed him to forget. But that night, something in Jason finally cracked. He asked her why she hated him so much. He asked what he had done as a child to deserve a lifetime of contempt. Eleanor's face changed for less than a second. It was not guilt exactly. It was fear quickly covered. Then she told him that not every rescued thing became worthy of the rescue. Jason left before he said something he could not take back. Rain was falling hard when he drove away from the mansion. The road outside town curved through a stretch of trees where the streetlights stood too far apart. Jason's hands were tight on the wheel, his mind still trapped in Eleanor's voice when a bicycle shot out from the side road. He saw the flash of a reflector, a small body leaning desperately, the slick shine of pavement under the tires. He slammed the brakes. The car skidded. The impact was not loud, but it was enough to tear the night open. For a moment, everything stopped except the rain. The boy on the road was small, maybe 7 years old, with dark hair plastered to his forehead and a bleeding cut near his temple. Jason moved without thinking. He called for help, wrapped his coat around the child, and kept speaking to him, even though he did not know if the boy could hear. The bicycle lay twisted nearby, one wheel still turning in weak circles. Later, Jason would remember that wheel with unbearable clarity, the way it spun, slower and slower, like time itself was running out. At the hospital, he gave his name, offered to pay, offered blood, offered anything they asked for. For once, money and status felt useless against the thin curtain of an emergency room. The boy's name was David Carter. Jason heard it from a nurse and felt no recognition at first, only dread. Then the nurse asked whether he knew the child's mother, Emily Carter, and the floor seemed to tilt under him. He told himself there could be many women with that name. Connecticut was not so small. 7 years was a long time. But when Emily came running through the hospital doors, pale with terror, Jason knew before she even looked at him. The child on the other side of the doors was not a stranger. The child was the life he had tried to erase. Emily did not greet him like a woman reunited with an old love. She looked at him like someone seeing the return of a wound. In the hours that followed, the truth came in pieces. David had been born months after Emily left. She had raised him alone, worked through exhaustion, answered his questions carefully, and protected him from the knowledge that his father had once rejected him before he took his first breath. Jason did not ask for proof, but proof arrived anyway in the small details that made denial impossible. David had Jason's rare blood type. He had the same small mark behind one ear. He had a fascination with old clocks and had been riding home with a broken watch in his backpack, a watch he had begged his mother to let him try to fix. The accident did not kill David, but it injured him badly enough to force Jason into the long corridor of consequence. He sat outside the pediatric ward with blood still on his cuff, staring at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. Emily kept distance between them, not out of cruelty, but because distance had been the only thing that allowed her to survive him. When Jason tried to apologize, the words sounded too small. Sorry could not rewrite 7 birthdays. Sorry could not sit beside Emily during fevers, school meetings, rent problems, and nights when David asked why other children had fathers at their games. Sorry could not make Jason brave retroactively. For the first time, Jason understood abandonment from the other side. As a child, he had waited for someone to come back. As a man, he had become the person who did not come. That realization did not excuse him. It stripped him. He saw himself not as the tragic orphan he had carried inside, but as a father whose fear had made another child carry the same emptiness. The shame was almost unbearable because it was deserved. Eleanor had taught him to fear losing his place, but she had not forced him to wound Emily. She had not forced him to choose silence for 7 years. That choice belonged to him. After David stabilized, Jason did something he had avoided for most of his adult life. He went back to Esther's house. It had been rented out for years, but the new owners had kept a few boxes in the attic after finding his name on them. The house smelled different now, painted and rearranged by other lives, but the attic still held dust, old wood, and a few remaining pieces of the boy he had been. Jason found Esther's sewing tin, a stack of repair manuals, and the blue coin jar, empty now, except for one tarnished screw at the bottom. Beneath a loose board near the rafters, he found a wooden box he had never seen before. Inside the box was a letter addressed to him in Esther's handwriting. There was also a hospital bracelet, a faded photograph of a young woman turned partly away from the camera, and a small silver locket engraved with initials that made no sense until they made too much sense. Esther's letter had been written when she was already ill. She explained that she had wanted to tell him sooner, but had been bound by a promise made under pressure and by her belief, perhaps foolish, that his mother would one day find the courage to speak for herself. She wrote that Jason had not been abandoned by a nameless woman lost to poverty or death. He had been given away by a young Eleanor Whitmore years before she became Eleanor Sterling. Jason read the name again and again, waiting for the letters to rearrange themselves into something less devastating. Eleanor, the woman who had mocked his gratitude, the woman who had called him a guest in his own home, the woman who had made him feel dirty for needing love. Esther wrote that Eleanor had been young, frightened, and pregnant from a relationship her family considered unacceptable. She had been engaged soon after to Charles Sterling, a match that promised wealth, rescue, and entry into the world she had always wanted. Keeping the child would have destroyed that future, so she gave the baby to Esther, along with money Esther barely touched, and demanded silence. The letter did not paint Esther as blameless. She admitted she had hoped love could soften a secret. She had hoped Eleanor would mature, confess, or at least provide from a distance. But Eleanor disappeared into the Sterling life and treated the past as something buried. Years later, when Charles brought Jason into the mansion without knowing who he really was, Esther had already been too sick to intervene. By then, Eleanor had recognized him. Jason knew that from the letter, from the dates, from the way Esther described the birthmark behind his ear. Eleanor had known. Not at first glance, perhaps, but soon enough. She had known exactly who Jason was, and she had still chosen cruelty. That truth did not arrive like a single blow. It arrived like a lifetime being retranslated. Every insult changed meaning. Every cold glance became confession. Every time Eleanor had called him an outsider, she had been speaking to the son she had thrown away. Jason thought of all the nights he had lain awake in the Sterling mansion, wondering whether his real mother missed him. She had been downstairs in silk pajamas, hosting guests, protecting her reputation, and pretending his pain had nothing to do with her. He had spent his life longing for a woman who had been close enough to hear him breathe. Jason returned to the Sterling mansion the next morning. The house looked exactly as it always had, polished and proud, as if truth could not enter rooms with marble floors. Eleanor was in the breakfast room, reading correspondence for a charity board that supported disadvantaged children. The hypocrisy of it might have made him laugh if he had not been so close to breaking. Charles was away at the workshop. The staff moved quietly around them. Jason waited until they were alone. Then he placed Esther's letter on the table. Eleanor's first reaction was denial, but it was too quick and too practiced to be convincing. She said Esther had been confused. She said old women invented stories when guilt made them sentimental. She said Jason was unstable because of the accident and should not make accusations that could ruin families. But Jason was no longer the boy who needed her permission to believe his own pain. He read the dates. He showed the bracelet. He spoke Esther's name. And with every detail, Eleanor's perfect composure thinned until the frightened woman beneath it finally appeared. When Eleanor admitted the truth, she did not do it with the tenderness Jason had once imagined from his mother. She defended herself first. She said she had been young. She said her family would have destroyed her. She said Charles would never have married her if he had known. She said she had done what women in desperate situations sometimes had to do. There was truth in some of that, but there was no love in the way she said it. She spoke of Jason's birth as a problem she had solved. She spoke of Esther's silence as a contract. She spoke of all the years afterward as if they were unfortunate complications, not a child's life. Jason listened until he could not listen anymore. He had wanted a mother for so long that part of him still searched her face for one, but he found only a woman terrified of losing the image she had built. That was when his grief changed. It did not become hatred exactly. Hatred would have kept him tied to her too tightly. It became clarity. Eleanor had not merely failed him in the past. She had trained him through shame and fear to repeat the same abandonment she had committed. She had made love feel dangerous, responsibility feel like ruin, and belonging feel like something granted by the powerful instead of built by the faithful. Charles came home before the confrontation ended. Jason had not planned for him to hear it, But secrets have a way of choosing their own witnesses once they are loose. Charles stood in the doorway with the color gone from his face as Eleanor tried to gather the letter from the table. In that moment, the Sterling mansion lost its illusion of order. Charles learned that the boy he had taken in out of kindness had been his wife's son all along. He learned that Eleanor had watched Jason suffer under their roof and had said nothing. The betrayal did not belong to Jason alone. It spread through the marriage, the company, and every public story Eleanor had told about compassion. But Jason did not stay to watch the collapse. He had spent too many years looking to that house for a verdict on his worth. Before leaving, he went to the old workshop and took only one thing from his bench, the first watch he had ever completed by himself, the one he had made with spare parts and Esther's encouragement. Charles tried to stop him, not with force, but with grief. He offered shares, security, anything Jason wanted. Jason was grateful for the love Charles had given him, imperfect as it was, but he could no longer build his life inside a name that had cost him so much of himself. He left the Sterling inheritance behind. For the first time, walking out of that house felt less like exile than rescue. Leaving Sterling did not make him a better man overnight. That is not how redemption works. Pain may reveal the truth quickly, but change proves itself slowly. Jason's first instinct was to run to Emily and explain everything, to tell her about Eleanor Esther, the letter, the secret, the reason fear had lived so deeply in him. But he knew explanation could become another form of selfishness if offered as a demand for forgiveness. Emily did not owe him tenderness because he had discovered his own wound. David did not owe him fatherhood because blood had finally been acknowledged. So Jason began where he should have begun years earlier, with responsibility. Emily made the boundaries clear. She did not want Sterling money. She did not want a dramatic apology. She did not want Jason appearing suddenly and confusing David with promises he might not keep. If he wanted to be in their lives, he would have to earn trust in the most ordinary ways. He would show up when he said he would. He would listen more than he explained. He would accept that David might reject him, question him, or simply feel nothing at first. He would not demand to be called father. He would not use guilt to speed up love. Jason agreed because for once he understood that love was not proven by intensity. It was proven by consistency. The first weeks were awkward. David knew Jason as the man from the accident and then as the man his mother spoke to in careful tones. He was curious but guarded in the way children become guarded when they sense adults are handling a truth too heavy for them. Jason started by visiting after school while Emily was present. He brought no expensive gifts. He asked about David's bicycle and offered to repair the damaged wheel. David watched him work with suspicious fascination. When Jason explained how tension in the spokes affected balance, the boy leaned closer despite himself. It was the first tiny bridge between them, not blood, not apology, but a wheel made steady by patient hands. There were harder days. David asked why Jason had not been there before, and Jason did not hide behind noble lies. He told the truth in words a child could bear. He said he had been afraid and wrong, and that David had done nothing to cause his absence. He said adults sometimes made terrible choices because they did not know how to face themselves, but that the child should never carry the blame. David did not forgive him in that moment. He only nodded and went back to his cereal. But Emily, standing near the kitchen sink, heard something in Jason's voice that had not been there 7 years earlier. He was no longer trying to escape the consequences. Jason built a new life, with less grandeur and more substance. He rented a small brick space near the river and turned it into an independent watch repair shop. At first, people came because of his sterling reputation. Later, they came because he listened to the stories behind the watches they brought in. A widow came with her husband's cracked wristwatch. A retired teacher came with a clock from her father's classroom. A young man came with a cheap watch that had belonged to his brother. Jason repaired what he could and treated even inexpensive pieces with reverence. He named the shop Esther House Time Works, though the sign was simple and easy to miss from the road. David loved the shop almost immediately. It was full of drawers, tools, magnifiers, soft cloths, and mysterious ticking sounds. Jason gave him safe pieces to examine and taught him that patience mattered more than force. If a part would not move, you did not break it open. You looked closer. Sometimes Emily would arrive after work and find them bent over the bench, David asking questions faster than Jason could answer. Those moments hurt her in a complicated way. She had wanted this for her son. She had also survived years without it. Watching Jason become gentle did not erase the memory of when he had been cruel. Jason understood that. He did not ask Emily to hurry her heart. He showed up for David's school project. He sat in the back row at a winter concert, not beside Emily like a husband, but not absent like a stranger. He learned which cereal David liked, which books calmed him, which nightmares came after storms. He kept his phone on at night. He drove them to follow-up appointments after the accident and sat quietly when doctors explained things Emily already knew how to handle alone. He was not heroic. He was present. And presence, after 7 years of absence, became its own quiet miracle. Emily's anger did not vanish, but it changed texture. At first, it had been sharp enough to protect her. Then slowly it became sadness, then caution, then something softer she did not trust at first. She noticed that Jason no longer spoke about the Sterling family as if their approval was oxygen. She noticed that when Eleanor's name came up, he did not tremble with the old need to be chosen. He had started therapy, though he did not advertise it. He had begun writing letters he did not send, not to excuse himself, but to understand where his fear ended and his responsibility began. Emily did not need a perfect man. She needed proof that the frightened man who abandoned her would not return the next time life became hard. The test came sooner than either of them expected. Sterling and Company, shaken by scandal inside the family, attempted to bring Jason back. Charles was ill from stress, the board was unstable, and several major clients had threatened to leave after rumors spread that Jason had resigned over family misconduct. A generous offer arrived through lawyers: ownership shares, creative control, public recognition, and financial security beyond anything his small shop could provide. Years earlier, Jason would have seen such an offer as salvation. Now he saw the question hidden inside it. Was he still willing to trade real love for a decorated cage? He did not answer immediately. That mattered. Courage was not the absence of temptation. He sat with the offer. He thought of Esther's kitchen, Eleanor's letter, Emily's face in the hospital, and David's small hands holding a screwdriver with too much concentration. Then he declined. Not because Sterling meant nothing, and not because Charles meant nothing, but because Jason finally understood that belonging purchased with self-betrayal would always become another form of abandonment. He visited Charles privately, made peace where he could, and promised to help the old craftsman transition designs if needed. But he did not return to the mansion. He did not let the family name become his compass again. When Emily learned he had refused, she did not rush into his arms. Their story was too wounded for that kind of easy ending. But she looked at him differently. She asked him what he wanted now that he was no longer chasing a place in the Sterling world. Jason told her he wanted to become the kind of man David could trust without fear. He wanted to love without running. He wanted, if Emily ever allowed it, to build something honest with her, even if it took years. He did not ask her to forget. He asked only for the chance to keep showing up. That answer did not heal everything, but it opened a door she had kept locked for a long time. David opened his door in his own way. One afternoon at the shop, after months of careful visits and small routines, he brought Jason a drawing from school. It showed 3 people standing beside a workbench with gears floating around them like stars. Under the first figure, he had written, "Mom." Under the second, he had written, "Me." Under the third, after rubbing out something and rewriting it, he had written, "Dad, Jason." He handed it over quickly, pretending it was no big deal. Jason looked at the paper and had to turn away for a moment because some gifts are too large to receive gracefully. He did not correct the title. He did not celebrate loudly. He simply placed the drawing above his bench where David could see that it mattered. Eleanor's fall was quieter than the audience of her life might have expected. Charles separated from her not with public cruelty, but with the finality of a man who had discovered that the foundation of his marriage had been false. The charity boards that had once adored her began to distance themselves when the truth emerged in careful, undeniable fragments. No one needed to shout. Eleanor's own life had become the testimony against her. For years, she had built her identity around refinement, sacrifice, and moral authority. But the son she abandoned, the boy she humiliated under her own roof, and the grandson she almost erased by teaching Jason fear, were living proof that image without love is only decoration over rot. Jason did not take pleasure in watching her lose status. That surprised him. There had been nights when he thought revenge would feel clean, but by the time truth arrived, he was too tired to confuse destruction with healing. He set boundaries instead. Eleanor was not welcome in David's life without Emily's consent. She was not allowed to use the language of grandmother, as if biology alone repaired harm. She wrote letters, at first some defensive, some tearful, some still too full of herself to be called apologies. Jason read them when he was ready, and answered few. He no longer needed to convince her of what she had done. The truth existed, whether she could bear it or not. Eventually, Eleanor asked to meet David. Jason refused the first time. Then he spoke with Emily, with David's counselor, and with David himself, in a gentle, age-appropriate way. The meeting, when it finally happened, was brief and carefully held. Eleanor arrived without pearls, for once looking smaller than the woman Jason remembered from the mansion. David stood beside Emily, curious but not affectionate. Eleanor cried when she saw him, perhaps because his face held both Jason's childhood and the years she could never recover. Jason watched her grief without surrendering to it. He allowed compassion to exist beside boundaries. That was one of the hardest lessons of his life. Forgiveness, if it came at all, did not have to mean giving unsafe people the keys to your future. In the months that followed, Jason worked on a watch unlike any he had made before. He did not design it for collectors. He did not design it for Sterling Archives magazine covers or auction houses. He designed it for Emily. The case was modest, the face clean, the movement visible through the back. No diamonds, no gold, meant to impress strangers, no grand display of wealth. The beauty was in the patience of it. Every part had been shaped, polished, adjusted, and tested by his own hands. Around the back edge, he engraved a sentence he had rewritten many times until it finally felt true. Time cannot return what we lost, but love can teach us how to begin again. He gave it to Emily in the workshop on an evening when rain tapped softly against the windows. David was there pretending not to watch while watching everything. Jason did not make a speech designed to erase pain. He told Emily that he had once abandoned her because he was terrified of being abandoned himself. He told her that fear explained the wound, but did not excuse it. He told her that family was not a surname, a mansion, or an inheritance. Family was the place where a person chose to remain when staying became difficult. He asked whether she would allow him to keep choosing her and David, not as a performance of regret, but as the life he wanted to live. Emily cried before she answered. Not because the watch fixed everything, not because a beautiful object could repay 7 years. She cried because the man standing in front of her was finally willing to tell the truth without hiding behind shame. The love she had buried had not died all at once. It had gone underground to survive. Now, carefully, painfully, it began to breathe again. She did not offer Jason a perfect future. She offered him the chance to build one honestly. And for Jason, who had spent his life begging for a place in a family built on secrets, that honest chance was worth more than every sterling fortune. David, with the innocent timing only a child could have, looked at his mother and said he thought Jason had learned how to be a dad. It was not a grand blessing, but it was the one Jason needed most. He knelt and held his son carefully, still amazed by the word son, because it no longer felt like an accusation. Emily joined them, and for the first time Jason felt the shape of a family that did not require him to become smaller, colder, or more afraid in order to belong. It was not the family he had imagined as a child. It was not the family he had tried to buy with obedience. It was the family he had almost lost, returned to him, not by luck, but by the long labor of becoming worthy of trust. Years later, people in town still talked about the Sterling scandal in lowered voices, as people often do when wealth fails to protect someone from truth. But Jason cared less and less about those whispers. His shop became known not for luxury, but for care. Parents brought children to watch him work. Elderly customers stayed too long because he listened. David grew tall enough to reach the higher drawers and began helping after school, first with cleaning tools, then with simple repairs. Emily sometimes teased Jason that he explained watch movements more gently than most people explained bedtime stories. He took that as a compliment. The old watch Jason had taken from Sterling sat in a glass case near the front of the shop. Beside it was Esther's blue coin jar holding the tarnished screw he had found in the attic. Customers often asked if the display was for sale. Jason always said no. Those objects reminded him where he had come from, but not in the way Eleanor had meant when she used those words as a weapon. They reminded him of Esther's kitchen, of patient love of the boy who had believed his mother would come back, and of the man who had finally learned that waiting for someone else to heal you can become another prison. Jason never called Eleanor mother easily. Some days he could not call her that at all. Healing did not turn history into something gentle, but he stopped letting her absence define the love he gave. That was the victory. He did not become Eleanor. He did not pass the wound untouched into David's hands. He broke the pattern in the only way patterns are truly broken, not with one dramatic declaration, but with repeated choices made when no audience is watching. He answered the phone. He kept his promises. He apologized without demanding comfort. He stayed. And that is the part of Jason's story that matters most. He was abandoned, and for a while abandonment taught him to abandon. He was humiliated, and for a while humiliation taught him to protect status over love. He was denied the truth, and for a while fear made him dishonest with the people who deserved his courage. But the past did not get the final word. Eleanor's secret explained the wound, but Jason's choices determined whether the wound would become an inheritance. In the end, he chose differently. Time did not give Jason back the first 7 years of David's life. It did not erase Emily's lonely nights, Esther's impossible promise, Charles's broken marriage, or the child Jason had once been waiting at windows for a mother who was never coming. But time gave him something else. It gave him the chance to stand in the place where pain had once ruled him and make a different decision. It gave him mornings in the workshop with his son. It gave him quiet dinners with Emily where silence no longer meant fear. It gave him a family built not from blood alone and not from reputation, but from truth repeated until it became trust. So if there is a lesson in Jason's life, maybe it is this. The people who hurt us may explain why we learned to fear love, but they do not get to decide what we do with that fear. We cannot always return to the moment before the damage happened. We cannot force the people who abandoned us to become who we needed them to be, but we can decide whether their choices will keep living through us. Jason lost years trying to earn love from a woman who had hidden from her own heart. He found peace only when he stopped begging the past to choose him and started choosing the people who were still there. If you were Emily, could you forgive Jason after everything he had done? And if you were Jason, would you have the courage to face the mother who abandoned you while pretending you were the stranger in her home? Leave your thoughts below, because stories like this remind us that family secrets do not stay buried forever. Sometimes the truth waits for the one moment when everyone believes the lie has won. And when that truth finally rises, it does not only expose what was hidden, it shows who is brave enough to change.